I'm going to be replacing these valve hushers on this Volvo B230 engine. It's in a 240. This particular one is a 1985, though this procedure should be the same on any Volvo 240 from, I think, what's it, 85 until 93 when they used these engines, as well as a lot of 740s and 940s that had this as well. And they basically just make the valves up here, or where the cam hits them, quieter. In theory, I've heard that worn out hushers can actually cause the engine to trip the, what's it called, or the computer will trip the knock sensor and cause it to run the engine rich and not run as well because it thinks it's knocking when it's just this. I don't know if that's true, but I'm doing the timing belt anyway. As you can see, it's very cracked, and I doubt this timing belt has much time left on it, so while I'm replacing the timing belt anyway, might as well go a couple extra steps and take the cam out and replace these. So to get started, it's just the same as if you were doing the timing belt. So I'm going to take off this fan over here with 4 bolts up at the water pump there. Then from there I can take off these belts and this water pump pulley, and then after that I can take off the well, we'll get there when we get there. That's the first step here. So the fan can be taken off by undoing 4 10mm bolts up there. In order to get at the last one, unless you're going to crank the engine over, you're going to have to loosen up the tensioner on the alternator so you can get these belts loose. And that's done with, there's a 13mm right in there. Can't really show it very easily, but just right in there, and you loosen that up. And then once you have that loose, you can just use another 10mm right here to loosen up the alternator tensioner, and then it will come loose, and then you can just move this and get to the last one of those over there. Fan shroud can be taken off with just these 2 Phillips head bolts up here, and once you do that, it'll slide back, tilt back, and pop out of the bottom, and with it you'll be able to take the entire fan, which will be loosely in there, along with this pulley. I think the pulley will just come off with it, or the fan. Anyway, the fan and the shroud will come right off. So on this car, actually, I found that I was able to get the fan out without taking the shroud out of the way first. I still took the shroud out of the way to make some room. I was surprised because on my other 240, or my 240 rather, this one isn't mine, I was able to just or I was not able to get the fan out without moving the shroud too, but on this one I could. Anyway, it was just 2 bolts and that came right out. Then for this here, this is the pulley that goes on the water pump. That will slide right off here. Just again, use the tensioner adjuster on the alternator to loosen the belts until they'll pop right off, and then you can just take this off. Now, if you're going to do the hushers, or in any way do anything that requires taking the camshaft out, now would be a good time to break this bolt loose. You can lightly tighten it again after, but this won't break loose anymore once you've taken the belt off. So now's a good time to get this off if you're going to be taking the cam off. Other than that, the next thing you have to do is to get down here. We'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so I've used a 17mm to take this off right there. This one down here at the bottom is a 24mm. Ideally, if you can get a 6-pointed one, that would be great. I have a 12-pointed one, unfortunately, but hopefully it'll work. Now, if you have a manual transmission, it's fairly easy. I mean, it's difficult, but you can just get someone to get in the car, stand on the brakes, put it in 4th gear, and then you can just wrench it off provided your clutch is good. If you have an automatic like this one, unfortunately, that's not really going to work. So there's a tool you can use in the back to lock the flywheel at the starter, or you can, let's see, what else can you do? An impact wrench would take it off fairly easily if you can fit one in here. Then you might have to take the radiator off. What I have done, and we'll see if this works, it's worked on other cars, so I think it'll work on this one. I just took a really long, fairly strong looking drive here and put it inside of a cheater bar, and then I'm just going to put it in here, and I'm going to use the starter like this, wedge it up in place, and then hopefully I'll be able to break it off with the starter. Before doing that though, it's a good idea to take out the fuel injection relay right here. In fact, you may even want to take out this relay and crank it a few times to make sure it doesn't start first. That's to prevent the car from starting when you have this in there. If there's no fuel, it won't start because you don't want it to actually start up there. And then I'm just going to hit it quickly with the starter. And that only took one really quick flick of the key, and it took the bolt right off. So now I can take this out. Now also might be a good time to line everything up with the timing marks. So up here, there's a timing mark on the cam. There's also a timing mark you can't see in here, you're going to have to deal with later, but there's also one more down here, and I should clean all these off so you can see them. There's a notch down in this piece right here, which shows all your timing marks for the timing belt. And this one seems to be missing on this car, so hopefully I'll be able to figure it out based on my other car. Oh no, you know what? It's right there. It should be the plastic, I think. And then, yeah, then you have all your timing marks all set up, and if all you're doing is the belt, it'll be real easy to just take off the old belt and put on the new one if the timing marks are already lined up. This crank pulley will come off after you have the bolt out. It takes a little bit of grunt work there. You might want to try using the tire, whatever it's called, tire iron to pry it out a little bit there on the not plastic parts. Do that and just kind of wiggle a little bit. It comes right out. Then there are two bolts, a 10mm and a 12mm respectively over here and here, that take out the bottom timing cover. I'd already had the top timing cover off, which was also two bolts, I believe. One's like there and one's up here somewhere. Yeah, right there. It's because I was inspecting the belt before, so I just took those off. Now we have those off, and now the next thing to do would be to take this bolt off here if you're going to replace the seal over here, because there are three seals. There's a crank seal down here, the cam seal up here, and this one's just like a cam seal, which is on the intermediate shaft, and those will all prevent oil from leaking out, as has obviously been going on in here because these seals aren't any good. Now's a good time to do it while you have the belt off anyway. And after you do that, then the timing belt will just come off with just loosening this bolt up here and squeezing this tensioner. And now that I've got the cam pulley off, the next thing I'm going to do is take out the camshaft, which can be done by taking off the valve cover. It's just these 10mm bolts on top there. If you're going to check the valve lash while you're doing this, now would be the time to do it. You want to do this before you put in those valve hushers, because they're going to throw off your reading when they're first put in. They're extra squishy and they're not seated quite in place, and they're going to throw it off. So you do this now, and the way you do it is spin the cam lobes so they're facing straight up, and you measure with a feeler gauge between here and here. If I had my feeler gauge with me, I'd do it. I did it on my previous car. I'm not bothering with this one because it's surprisingly low miles, and I don't think it has to be dealt with. My other one was fine with a lot more. But the valve lash, it says over on the plate over here, and it says when warm it should be between 0.016 and 0.018 inches. Slightly less for cold. If you look up online, I'll put it in the description. I usually prefer to do these when they're cold because it's not really going to be warm by now. If you're going through all this process, it's going to cool off. So I'll put those in the descriptions. And after I measure those, if they were all fine on my other car, if they aren't, then you're going to end up taking out the spacers or the shims, the valve shims that go in here. So if you are, now's the time to actually replace them to fix the valve lash if you have to. So once I have all those measured, if you're going to do that rather, then just take all these off and the cam will come right off. And then you can see these right here have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 printed on these, and they also match up down in there. Keep record of that or make note of that when you're putting them back in, because these all have to go in the right spots. They're not identical to each other. They have to go in the right spots. So I'm going to take these out, 2 bolts for each, and then the cam will come right out. Okay, so now might be a good time to wash your hands or put on new gloves if you're wearing them, because you're dealing with stuff where you don't want all the dirt you probably have on your gloves to get into. So these right here are all the lifters, and you can just pull these right out, actually. I find I can just grab them. It's a little bit difficult, but if you, okay. I might have to get something underneath there. Anyway, this one came out, and so right here you have, right here is the shim that spaces it there. So you just kind of have to get, if any of your valve measurements were off when you were checking the valve lash, you just kind of pop these out, stick a small flathead screwdriver in the ends there, and they'll just pop right out. And then you just kind of get whatever the difference was. So if your valve lash was, say, 0.002 inches off, 0.002 inches too close, then you'd get one that's 0.002 inches thinner or thicker if it was too far away, and that's how you adjust the valve lash on these. So if you can't read the thickness that's printed on these, which very little chance you can anymore, then you're actually going to have to measure them with a caliper. So you just measure this with a caliper and then change whatever the difference is. It's also possible that if you have a couple of them that need to be adjusted, hold on to them, because you might have one that's the right thickness and then you have to buy fewer shims. But anyway, that's how you shim it. But I'm not bothering with that on this one because I don't even have a caliper anyway, and I don't think it's a problem on this car in the first place. But what I am going to do is replace, these are the valve hushers in here, and you can see these are totally flat and brittle. In fact, this will probably break when I try to get it out. I'll do that in a second when I have my small flathead screwdriver again. But you just kind of pop these little things off right here, and they will probably break and shatter, so be careful about that when you try to get them off if they're as old as these are, because they're super brittle. And I'm going to take those off, and then I'll put on the new ones. And here you can see an old one here next to a new one. And these are rock hard, actually, and brittle. They'd shatter very easily, whereas the new one looks just like this. And they just slide over, so let me just get my screwdriver for a second here. It takes a little bit of effort to get this out because you have to get, it would probably be easier with a thinner screwdriver than this one, but it just kind of pops off and you can see the whole thing right there. And I'm going to grab the new one and just press it right into place, just like that. Make sure it's on, and then I'm going to take my, oh, just get a little bit of some sort of thing in there. Take this, just drop it right back on top of there, and then that's done. Just do them for all 8 of these. And after replacing all those, I put the cam back in, and now I'm going to start putting all these back on. And it's, again, we have our marks on here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the numbers should be toward the back up here. While I'm putting in the first one, I'm also going to put in the new crank seal. Just put it in right now. It's the easiest time to do it, and put it under here. Also, remember there is a seal. And depending on whether this is in a 740 or a 240, I still have to get this out here. It's a bit of a leftover, what's it called? The seal and the gasket in there, yeah. There also is going to be a seal at the back, which will, in the case of 240s or anything that has this, the distributor driven up here on the side of the engine, is just going to have a plug just like this. If the distributor is driven by the back or driven off the cam, then you're going to have a another seal like this on the front, because you're going to have more going out the back of the engine. And when you're tightening these down on here, there is a torque spec, and I'll post it in the description here of what these should all be torqued down to. I don't know off the top of my head, and I don't have a torque wrench anyway. I don't recommend doing this though, actually, because you can definitely over torque them and break something or strip out one of these bolts here pretty easily. And these were significantly over torqued. Somebody must have worked on this engine before. When I got here, they were over torqued. So I would actually definitely recommend getting a torque wrench and torquing it down to the specs for what these are supposed to be, rather than just guessing. Do as I say, not as I do. But also bring them down a little bit at a time, move around. Don't over tighten any, just kind of go in small steps, because some of the valves are going to get pushed open by these, and you don't want to have it just kind of off center there. So just like slowly move across here. I think there might even be a pattern, or there, maybe not. I think that's probably actually just for head gasket bolts, but just very small amounts at a time, and just slightly more and more. Don't move any of them too much at once, and be careful not to over torque. After that, make sure to clean out any of the old gasket material, put down your new gasket. Some people like to put a little bit of some sort of a sealant or gasket maker in there and there on these. I usually don't do it. I haven't had a problem before, but if you feel like it, you can put a little bit of some sort of a gasket maker in there, and then put back on the valve cover, lining up all the studs there, and then put all the nuts back on top, making sure to also torque them down to spec. I'm doing this again by feel, because I don't have a torque wrench. You really should start, doing the corners and then across. Like, don't put down two nuts that are near each other. Kind of go across to make sure that the whole thing goes down slowly, like it's supposed to, and ideally use a torque wrench. And these are fairly easy to strip. These require a lot less torque than you think they do, so be careful with those. Okay, next up I got the intermediate shaft seal right here, and I was able to actually get it out really easily just by sticking a flathead screwdriver underneath and prying right out. And after that I have a new one, and I'm just going to press that right into place. I think I'll be able to do this entire thing with my fingers. If not, I'll use I might need something a little bit to press down on the bottom there, but this one's not too difficult to get in. So to get out the crank thing over here, to get the crank seal, this is a bit difficult to get out. I find the easiest way is get a small flathead and just kind of from side to side rock it out from the underneath over here. It's the best way I've found to do it. It's still going to take a while. You got to go this side, then this side. Do it a bunch of times until it gets loose enough to just pop off. But I don't really see any other way to get in there without damaging the belt guide behind it. This crank seal was also fairly easy to get out. It was just as simple as prying it out with a small flathead, but this is going to be a bit more difficult to put in than this one was up here. So I think that the best way to do this one, I just managed to find a larger piece of metal, and I'm just going to put this over and hammer it in there. If you can find something else to span it like that, I was lucky. I don't even know what this came from. I just found it around here. But that's probably the easiest way to do it, because you got to get this one in all the way. Otherwise, it can kind of, I've seen before that they will, if they're not put in all the way, they can grab well, on the friction here and tear off, and then you end up spraying oil everywhere. So that's got to get put in there, and I'm just going to, it doesn't require too much force, just there, and then I'm just going to lightly mallet it in. So, as always, reassembly is the reverse of disassembly. I have all the camshaft, the intermediate shaft, and the crank pulleys all back down on there, and then you have to start lining up all the timing marks before you put the belt on. So this has to line up with this notch right up there. There's also, the intermediate shaft does have to be timed up correctly because it drives the distributor. So this has to be lined up. There's a notch, you're not going to see it on the video here, but you'll find it on your own car. There's a notch right there that it has to line up with. That's difficult because you obviously aren't at the same level. Fortunately, a lot of belts have marks on them. I'll get to that in a second. But then the crank one down here, there is this notch in this plate right here, which, if it's not totally down, can spin around, but once it's pushed up completely against the pulley, the notch, this is not timed up correctly, so that's why it's not in the right spot. This should be lined up with a mark right here. It's a little bit difficult to tell, but it's on this line in the casting right here, this little notch, and that should line up with right there. So I'm going to rotate this slightly. Keep in mind that it could be 180 degrees out, the crank and the camshaft with each other, so if it doesn't work when you first do it, then you may have to spin the crank around once and then bring it to the right spot. But if you haven't moved it significantly since the belt's been off, it should be fine. Just time those up and then put the belt on, you're good to go. A lot of belts have timing marks on them like this, all the ones I've come across anyway. So there's one here which goes on this dot on the camshaft. There's another single line over here which goes on the other dot over here. So if you have a difficult time seeing the dot over here and lining it up with there, just make sure the cam's lined up, and you can use the other line and make sure the line is lined up with the dot on that one. That's a good way to measure the intermediate shaft. There's also a double line here, which I believe will, in some way, that represents the crank. We'll see for sure when I have it back on, but I think if you spin it around such that the dot, or the notch in there gets on this line, then it's timed up correctly the first. I'm not entirely sure how that works. It's a little bit weird. We'll see. But anyway, as long as the crank is on that timing mark and the cam's on the timing mark, you can use these two to make sure your intermediate shaft is lined up. Okay, and then after you've got your timing marks lined up on top here and down in there and tightly around the bottom of the crank on this side, then just loop it around here, and to actually get the tensioner on, make sure it's slightly loose so that it'll squeeze on the spring here, and then just simply, if I can grab on here, fortunately I have the transmission line in the way a little bit of grabbing over here, but just kind of grab from there, squeeze it in, and then you should be able to just pop the belt right over onto there. And it's a little bit difficult, but when it's ready, it will happen. There we go. And now it can just be pushed into place. Now might be a good time to again check your timing marks and tighten this up a bit. And then keep in mind that after you tighten this up here, you need to, in about 1,000 miles or so, loosen it up and then retighten it after the engine's run. I'm just continuing to put everything together. I've put the crank pulley back on here, put these belts on. On this particular car, that belt's staying off because the air conditioner doesn't work and the power steering leaks a lot, and so I just pulled both the belts off for now. Then put these bolts back on. You have to put them in, you have to put all of them in slightly before you can put any on all the way, because you can't actually get them in once you've tightened one up. Putting this fan and shroud on makes me glad that I've converted mine to an electric fan. I did test it right after I put everything back together and put in the crank pulley bolt down on the bottom and tightened up all the bolts on top. Just tested to make sure that that the car started and ran fine, because don't want it to find out after putting everything back together that you've timed it wrong. That would be unfortunate. But everything seems to be doing well. And once you put everything back together, that's just about it. So I'm just going to take this and drive it around now. At some point, I think it's roughly about 1,000 miles, you're supposed to recheck the tension on here, which all you do to do that is just unscrew this a little bit, loosen it up, and then tighten it back up in about 1,000 miles. Once you have the top timing belt cover on there, there is actually a plug that you can pull out, so you don't have to take the timing cover off again to do that. That's just about all there is to it. That should get you the timing belt and tensioner, the valve gasket, and then any shims and those valve hushers.